Welcome. I'm Sharon Griffith with the Pound Ridge Historical Society, and we're going to take you on a virtual tour of historic Pound Ridge with the third graders of Pound Ridge Elementary. Let's go. I think we'll start our tour right here at the Pound Ridge Elementary School. Did you know that before your school was built in 1939, all the children in town went to 7 different schools? Kids walked to the school nearest their home. There are still quite a few of these school buildings left, and we'll point them out to you as we go along. That big White House across the road from school and in front of Pound Ridge Nursery was an important place during the Revolutionary War when American patriots were fighting the British. A British lieutenant named Tarleton came to burn Pound Ridge, but he was stopped by Colonel Sheldon. Thankfully, only 2 buildings were burned. This is the community church. It was built in 1833, and it was just a very little building then. Next to it is the parsonage, once home to Judge Lockwood, one of the first town supervisors. This part of the town is called the Hamlet. Across the street, that little yellow building is the Pound Ridge Museum, where we have exhibitions from our town's history. Hopefully it'll be open soon and you can visit. Next to the museum is Conant Hall, which was once a church, but is now used for a lot of different community events. And the Huntress was once a grocery store, before there were supermarkets. Across the road is the Inn at Pound Ridge. It was once a house, but it was turned into a famous restaurant by a man named Hiram Halley. Hiram Halley came to Pound Ridge in the 1920s. He was a very rich man and a philanthropist, meaning he gave a lot of money to good causes, and happily he thought Pound Ridge was a good cause. Mr. Halley gave the land to build your school in exchange for this building, the Pound Ridge Library. This started out as a little one-room schoolhouse. See the bell on top of the entrance? It didn't become a library until 1952. Next is the gun house. It was called the gun house because the only big gun in all of Pound Ridge during the Revolutionary War was stored in a small shed near it. In 1846, after the election of President Polk, they shot the gun off to celebrate, but the gun didn't fire correctly and it blew off the arm of a man who was from then on called One-Arm Slauson. He survived and lived a long life. Do you know what Trinity means? It means 3. Trinity Lake was formed by joining 3 smaller lakes to create this one large reservoir which holds water for the city of Stamford. In the old days, this road passed by 3 lakes, so it became known as Trinity Pass. The farmers used to have a great big picnic here by the lakes every summer. This path leads to the Halley Ravine. It, too, was land that belonged to Mr. Halley. You should ask your parents to take you for a walk on the beautiful trails that are part of the Pound Ridge Land Conservancy. Here's Hiram Halley's house, his own house. The original 5-room house was built around 1760. It is said that there's a secret passage leading to a space under the main stairs, and it was used as a stop on the Underground Railroad. Next door is the house where his brother lived, the Brown House. And just beyond it, across the pond, is a little Swiss chalet that was actually brought all the way over from Switzerland. The little bridge crosses the old Mill River. Once there was a sawmill here. Mills are very important in the old days. They were used for grinding flour, cutting wood, and even making cider. Across from the river, you can see the remains of the railroad beds for a railroad line that was planned to connect Danbury and Stamford in the late 1800s. It was supposed to come through Pound Ridge. Some investors thought it would bring jobs, but many residents thought it would ruin the town's peaceful and serene beauty. Whatever, the investors ran out of a lot of money fairly soon, and the project was abandoned. Pound Ridge was mostly a farming town. Stone walls were used to fence in animals and mark boundaries between the farms. They used stone instead of wood for their fences because the soil was filled with rubble, rocks and stones left by the retreating glaciers. So in order to farm the land, they had to clear out the rubble. There are other ways Pound Ridge families earn their living besides farming. Have you ever heard of a cottage industry? It means you worked in your cottage, your home, making things to sell like shoes, shirts, hats. But the most important cottage industry in our town was baskets. Ice harvesting was another big business in Pound Ridge during the 17 to 1800s. In those days, ponds often froze down 12 inches or more, and special tools were needed to cut it. Sometimes took 2 full days to harvest the ice from a medium-sized lake like Kitchewan. But one of those would produce over 1 million pounds of ice, and at 10 cents a pound, that could bring in more than $10,000. This house used to be the Rock Hill School. It was one of the one-room schoolhouses in town. A chalkboard and eraser troughs are still on the wall. It has been added to over the years and is now a private home. Barnegat Road is one of the oldest roads in Pound Ridge. It was the main road to New Canaan and also the Danbury Post Road. That means a stagecoach, pulled by horses, would come along this road carrying travelers and the mail. Imagine how this road looked 300 years ago. There are only 9 of those old houses still remaining. In those days, the roads were not paved, and there were no snowplows. Maybe they planted trees along the road to help people find their way in winter. That red house at the bottom of the hill was built about 300 years ago, directly onto rock ledge. There is no basement. We know that it's old because of the way the kitchen fireplace was built. It said you could feel the vibrations of the horses' hooves on the giant rocks back there as they came up Barnegat Road. At the bottom of the hill is one of the old basket shops. Fernando Barker, known as Fred, lived here, and his grandson, born around 1900, was the last Pound Ridge basket maker. The dark blue house is one of the oldest in the area. Its red door is original, and that indentation that looks like a parking area in the stone wall was used for shoeing horses. The Stephen Jarvis house was also owned by a basket maker. His shop was attached in the back, the little section with the red door. The current owners have added a garage. Do you see the pond? All basket shops needed a pond. The wood logs needed for the baskets were soaked in the water, which made them wood soft, and you needed it soft enough to split into strips to be woven into baskets. Now we're going to stop at Rockgate Farm, another very old house. Mr. Everett is going to give us a tour of the gravesite of John Raymond, first soldier killed in the Revolutionary War. The stone lime kiln, a Barnegat, in the back was used to bake oyster and clamshells, and they also have an outhouse.
Hi, my name is Robbie Everett. This is Barnegat Road, where our house is. We've lived here for 30 years. And over the course of time, we've learned more and more about the house and who'd lived here before us. The house was built in about 1740, which is a long time back. And one of the families that lived here at the very beginning was a family named Raymond. And John Raymond was the first guy who ever won the Congressional Medal of Honor and was the first man who died in the American Revolution. So we moved here 30 years ago. And we did a little bit of exploring and have found out a number of things about the house, and we'll show you as we go along. We had no idea that one of the things we would like most about this house is that we had our own graveyard. I can't be certain that John Raymond was buried here because he was an American Revolutionary hero, but a bunch of his family members, and over the years many other family members from other families that lived here, were buried right here in the yard. As I think I mentioned, the road is called Barnegat Road, and the Barnegat itself is this structure here. What it was back then in the 1700s was a chimney that they boiled oyster and clam shells to make a primitive paste that would hold the rocks together so that they could create a foundation for a house or a building. Even to this day, we find oyster and clam shells in the yard that they were going to burn up and make into a paste back in those days. Now the Barnegat has been there for 250 to 300 years, and they still exist all around, although they're used for other purposes. It's basically what's known as a lime kiln. Oh, didn't know you were out here. That is, in fact, the outhouse. Back in the 1700s, 1800s, and for half of the 1900s, they didn't have bathrooms. They had an outhouse, and that is what was used.
The people on Barnegat went to church in East Woods Road, which they reached by a path through the woods. During wet weather, the children couldn't make this trip because of the mud, so Mr. Samuel Selleck decided to build the Selleck's Corners Chapel for the children in 1851. Though it's actually in New Canaan, Connecticut, it served Pound Ridgers. The Sellecks were another famous basket-making family. Both of these houses were built by the same man in exactly the same way. This one, the first one, was the home of George Nelson Selleck, who was a hermit. That means he never went outside. Every week, a man from town would bring him food, and Mr. Selleck would lower a basket from the second floor to bring up his food, and no one ever saw him. All the kids in town thought he was kind of scary. Scott's Corners was also known as Basket Town because there were so many houses there that were also basket shops. Have any of you been to Blind Charlie's? Blind Charlie was a Schofield and a famous basket maker. He lost his sight when he was only 10 years old, but he was so good that he was asked to judge basketry competitions. He hired a young boy to drive his horse-drawn wagons filled with baskets for sale. Sometimes they would travel as far away as New York City, 50 miles away. This is where our town government is located, the police station, and the Pound Ridge Townhouse. The house and property were left to our town by the Slade family. Burial Hill is our town cemetery, and I'm sure you all recognize the town park. Remember how I told you about One-Armed Slauson? Well, Mr. Slauson once owned all this land, but in the 1950s, the Pound Ridge Fire Department bought the land and gave it to the town for a park. Finally, we're almost back to school. Old Pound Road is on a ridge where the Native Americans built stone pens called pounds to keep their captured animals. Later, farmers used the pounds to keep their animals. Our town was named for this pound on the ridge. Well, we're back now at the museum. Thank you so much for joining us. I hope you had a wonderful tour of this colonial Pound Ridge, and I hope we'll see you back here soon. Thanks for coming.